So welcome everyone to Ideas That Matter. This is a series of focused presentations by people who we think have a lot to learn from. It's hosted by Inclusion Press and the Marcia Forrest Center, which has a focus on community inclusion and families. And Kathy Hollins is our chair, and she's right there on the board. So what we want to do is just welcome you in, and Linda has a few things to say.
Well, I just wanted to add my greetings and hello and just let you know that we have absolutely had folks register from around the world, from Canada and from the US and Scotland and Germany and the Czech Republic and Mexico and Western Australia. And we're very grateful for being able to come together like this in what is the 20th Ideas That Matter session since Don McKnight launched us in September of 2020. And as we come together now, we want to give one another just grace and our presence, and just offer that we know that we need this story now more than ever, and this time to come together and to be with one another. And we wanted to set the tone with an offering of a poem with resonance for today.
This poem is, we think, suitable for this time. It's by Pastor Martin Niemöller. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. We live in challenging times. This is a time to stand up and be counted. And so we invite Tom Kohler and Susan Earl to tell us an amazing story about a man of resilience and wisdom. Tom and Susan.
Thank you, Jack. Very kind. Just to say that we are delighted to be here, and we are going to try to offer 4 specific things today. We are going to tell the story of Waddie Welcome and the beloved community, and that will take the majority of our time. We're also going to share, thanks to Linda's electronic capacities, some material from Tim Snyder, whose book Tyranny has become important, at least to many people we know here in Savannah. We're also sharing a handout, characteristics of people who saved Jews during the Holocaust, that I prepared many years ago after reading The Moses of Ravno. Doug Hunneke wrote the book. He interviewed 300 people that had risked their lives on behalf of others, and there are 10 characteristics that he developed from that. And so we're offering that. And then we're also offering a little guidance on how to do what we're calling a kitchen table reading, which is to bring a small group of people together in a very low-tech way to share the book, Waddie Welcome and the Beloved Community. Our intention today is to tell the story about Waddie Welcome and the Beloved Community. And I thought maybe a way to start would be to read the definition of beloved community, and I'm going to read it twice. The reason I'm going to do that is I'm asking everyone who's listening in to sort of tune up their listening skills, because as I'm told that, and I believe it, many of us have stopped listening because we can't stand what we're hearing anymore. And also attention spans are getting shorter. So today, we're all going to have to work hard to tune back up our listening skills. The beloved community, and I might ask you just to close your eyes and let these words wash over you twice. The beloved community is not a utopia, but a place where the barriers between people gradually come down and where citizens make a constant effort to address even the most difficult problems of ordinary people. Above all else, it's an idealistic community. And that's Reverend Jim Lawson, who was in many ways sort of the teacher of the American Civil Rights Movement. The beloved community is not a utopia, but a place where barriers between people gradually come down and where citizens make a constant effort to address even the most difficult problems of ordinary people. It is above all else an idealistic community. The story that we're going to share today has been shared in many ways. We're going to share it in the original form, the slideshow. The book, Waddie Welcome and the Beloved Community, emerged after Jack, Linda, and John O'Brien attended a slide presentation and walked up afterward and said, "Can you see this as a book?" And I had good sense to say, a better question is, can you see this as a book? And they could. Book was published in 2004, and people across the world were invited to do these kitchen table readings on Martin Luther King Day, and that happened for many years and continues in some communities. The book did lead to a stage play being written and performed in Cincinnati, Ohio. Much to our excitement and thrill, we were able to go and see the stage play. And then just months before COVID hit in the United States, Susan and I were invited to sit down with two film producers to discuss how the story could become a movie, but COVID closed that conversation, if you will. So it's nice to be doing this again with everyone today, especially in these times. And we are living in a time where the mighty want to rule the many, a time where difference is being demonized, a time where might makes right, a time when cruelty equals currency, and a time where white equals right. We are living simply in the time of the bully. So Susan and I are curious. We are curious to see if we collectively can draw parallels, draw lessons from the Waddie Welcome and the Beloved Community story to what is happening in the United States today as the time of the bully reemerges. Are there lessons to be learned about character, connection, compassion, personal resilience, and renewal? Are there lessons that we learned about how to protect vulnerable people in the face of repression? Susan and I will share the reading today. My part will be a mixture of image and word. The screen will go blank during Susan's two parts as she reads from her essay, Waddie Welcome and the Beloved Community. The blank screen is intentional. This is when I need to ask you to do your deepest listening, to close your eyes and let the words wash over you. Because this is where the deepest parts of the story lay, is in the two sections that Susan will read. They're fairly long. Again, we're challenging everyone to use their deepest listening skills and their strongest concentration skills. So as you look and listen, please use the chat to share what you're seeing, hearing, feeling, and let's discover what we might learn together. Well, Waddie Welcome was born 110 years ago in the American South. Neither he or his parents had the right to vote, the right to attend school, or to even be seen in the town of Savannah, Georgia after the sun went down. They had to be what was called behind the wire when the sun went down. Mr. Welcome's mother and father lived just after the time of slavery, and Mr. Welcome was born closer to the time of slavery than to the 1964 passage of the Voting Rights Act in the United States. So the Welcome family, Carrie, Henry, Waddie, and his brothers and sisters all knew what it was like to live during the time of the bully. So, Waddie Welcome was born on the 4th of July in 1914 in Savannah, Georgia, one of 5 brothers and 2 sisters. His mother and father, Carrie and Henry Welcome, moved to Savannah in the mid-1920s. That was a 90-mile trip. They made the trip in a mule-drawn wagon. It took 4 or 5 days, most likely. They settled on Battery Street in the Kohler community, which is just to the southwest of downtown Savannah today. Back in that day, the Kohler community would have had dirt streets, outhouses, no indoor plumbing, pigs, chickens, and some cows were in the neighborhood. It was a neighborhood where many Black people who were escaping the naked oppression of the rural South had immigrated into Savannah to have at least a little better life. The next slides are going to give you just a feel for the neighborhood, if you will. Next. So this is Bethlehem Baptist Church, just to the east of the neighborhood. Next. You'll see here the church dinners are cooked daily, red rice, chitlins, and collards. Not everybody knows what chitlins is. Many of you don't want to know what a chitlin is. Next. This is Juanita's Seafood, just to give you, again, a flavor for the neighborhood. Next. In the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, etc., the neighborhood was prominent. It was a middle-class Black neighborhood. And much of the planning for the civil rights movement here in Savannah, Georgia, was done at Mr. Law's house in the Kohler neighborhood. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the neighborhood began to be rougher, more absentee landlordism and that sort of thing. Today, the neighborhood is, quote, in play, as the realtors like to say. It's being regentrified. Next. This is Sharon's Lounge. Mr. Welcome's neighborhood, like most urban neighborhoods, has a very distinct, different daytime and nighttime life. I will say that Mr. Welcome preferred untaxed spirits to taxed spirits, if you know what I mean. He loved to drink in the company of men huddled together. Next. This is the Savannah Checkers Club in Mr. Welcome's neighborhood. It costs $1 a month to be a member. Next. And this is just an example of how tight-knit the neighborhood was. The Checkers Club, probably 40 churches in the neighborhood, a very tight-knit African-American neighborhood. Next. The church is dotted with, the neighborhood is dotted with churches of all types. Jerusalem Baptist Church here, likely hand-built by the membership. Next. The Revival sign, clearly hand-painted. This is not a corporate neighborhood. Instead, it's a neighborhood where people used what they had. They didn't have much, but they used what they had. Next. In this slide, I want to point out how the resourcefulness of the neighborhood. You'll notice that the top 3/4 of this sign, you'll notice when it gets to the word guest speaker, from there on down, the background is a little bit whiter than the top 3/4. The sign would be used year after year after year, just with the bottom third being painted over. Again, a sign of this notion of resourcefulness, not a lot of money among these folks. Next. This is a house that Mr. Welcome grew up in. The porch is important. Carrie Welcome, Mr. Welcome's mother, had a treats store. She made cookies, cooked cupcakes, maybe had candy, that sort of thing, and she ran on the front porch. Mr. Welcome was on a pallet, and if anyone tried to steal anything or take something without paying, he would raise some hell, and his mom would come to know out and kind of square things up. Now, there was no vocational rehabilitation agency. There was no, Mr. Welcome was born before the Social Security Act. So in 1935, so again, the insular nature and the we have to take care of our own nature of the neighborhood shows through. Next. This is Connor's Temple Church on the northeast corner of the neighborhood. Mr. and Mrs. Welcome and all of their children were members. Henry Welcome, Mr. Welcome's father, was a deacon in the church, even though he was blind for a good part of his adult life, and he taught Sunday school. It's said that he had committed long portions of the Bible to memory and was a leader in the congregation. Next. When Mr. Welcome lived in the neighborhood, this was the Wage Earners Bank, which was the first bank to be organized by African-American people in the state of Georgia. More recently, it's become the Ralph Mark Gilbert Civil Rights Museum. Next. Well, this is Waddie Welcome in the mid-1980s. I just met him living in the Heritage Park Nursing Home, where he had been detained, if you will. Mr. Welcome had lived with his family for over 70 years and then was placed by Adult Protective Services in this nursing home when neighbors were worried about whether Mr. Welcome was being cared for adequately by his brother, the last remaining family member that was alive after his parents died. I'm not going to suggest that Adult Protective Services is the same as ICE, but I'm not going to not suggest it either. When I met Mr. Welcome, he was in this reclining high chair in the hallway of Heritage Park Nursing Home, and I pushed him back into his room for some privacy and bent down to try to talk with him. And as I spoke, I would speak to him, and I would try to listen and he would try to listen and respond. And then he would kind of look over my left shoulder, break concentration. I would stand closer and talk louder because, I'm a trained professional. And as I would stand closer and talk louder, he would listen and then look over my left shoulder. And then finally, I looked back over my left shoulder. And as I had closed the door, it turns out there was a poster on the wall of 3 young women wearing string bikinis. That's a California cruising poster. And when I turned, and my knees almost buckled because I'd never seen that in a nursing home before. When I turned around, Mr. Welcome laughed at me as hard as anybody could laugh at anyone else. He laughed from like head to toe. And that's when I realized, okay, now I'm beginning to learn who you are. Now I'm beginning to know who this man is. Now, I tried to recruit a citizen advocate for Mr. Welcome, and it took a long time. I asked 39 people, and no one said yes. During that time, the state closed the Heritage Park Nursing Home and because of health and safety violations, and Mr. Welcome was deported, if you will, 3 hours out of Savannah to a nursing home in Abbeville, Georgia, kind of across the county line, across our border to Abbeville. I drove over and found Mr. Welcome. He looked a little different than this, of course, and the place looked a little different than the nursing home here in Savannah, although it was an abandoned black school from the days of segregation. I did find a letter in Mr. Welcome's nightstand that was addressed in big, fat Clark lead pencil, then return address to Mr. Welcome, and the return address said A. Reeves. So I did drive back to Savannah with 2 things. I knew that Mr. Welcome wanted to come back to Savannah because when I asked him that one question, again, his body shook the word yes. And I had the address of someone named A. Reeves. Next. Well, I got back to Savannah and called directory assistance. Some of you remember what that might be. And I found a phone number for A. Reeves. I called Addie Reeves, and after some sort of yammering about what I was trying to do, she said, "Is this about Waddie?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Come over." And I said, "I'd like to set up an appointment to come visit next week." And she said, "Come over." And I said, appointment. And 30 minutes later, I found myself standing on the doorstep of 115 Waltz Drive in Yamacraw Village. Now, I'm not proud of this, but I'm just going to say it. When I was growing up, Yamacraw was used as a code word for the worst of it. So like Milledgeville was used as a code word for crazy in the state of Georgia. Milledgeville Central State School and Hospital in Milledgeville being the largest institution in the world during my childhood and young adulthood, 15,000 people on one campus. Well, Miss Reeves lived in the far backside of the Yamacraw Village. A huge, beautiful oak tree, lovely cast iron bench was on her porch. And so I knocked on the door. "Come on in." I did. "Want some cake?" "No, ma'am." "Want some cake?" "No, ma'am." "Want some cake?" "Yes, ma'am." Now, I would soon learn that this form of communication, Ms. Reeves telling you what you wanted, even if you didn't know you wanted it at the time, was her standard operating procedure. And this was between her and a wide variety of people. Now, Ms. Reeves told me about herself, coming to Savannah from the deeply rural Burke County. The mule knew when to stop plowing at night. About working for Savannah Sugar, sewing sugar bags for a nickel an hour. Ms. Reeves told me about being the oldest member of Connor's Temple, about the pastor's wife's hymnline, "Too High," and about meeting Waddie Welcome's father, Henry, in the 1920s. She told me that when Waddie's mother, Carrie, had died, Carrie had asked her to, quote, watch over Waddie. And she had done that for 40 years. She told Carrie that she would watch over her son, and she had done that. Mrs. Reeves, when I met her, was now 85 years old. She clearly loved Mr. Welcome, but she was a better worrier and a better lover than she was a bureaucracy chaser. So I continued to look for a citizen advocate for Mr. Welcome, someone who would try to get him back here to Savannah and then back home in a more spiritual way. Next. I had known Lester Johnson through a Leadership Savannah program in the late 70s. I called, and he was immediately willing to get involved after he heard Mr. Welcome's story. And in fact, we agreed to drive to Abbeville the next week together to meet Mr. Welcome. On the way back in the car together, there was no question. Lester would become Mr. Welcome's citizen advocate. He would use his negotiating skills, his status in our community as an attorney, and also his wide network of people to do what needed to be done to help Mr. Welcome return to Savannah. Next. Lester would get Mr. Welcome back here to Savannah, and that would mean filling out lots and lots of paperwork, obviously meeting Mrs. Reeves and hearing her story, and quite frankly, becoming energized by who she was as a human being, making lots of phone calls, filling out paperwork, and finally, Westview Nursing Home in Port Wentworth was where Mr. Welcome came back to Savannah, and at the last minute, Lester had to stroke a personal check for $300 for the ambulance to bring Mr. Welcome back from Abbeville. All this happened just in a couple of months. Next. So now you see bring Mr. Welcome back home, back to Savannah, set the stage for a much longer journey, bringing him back home again in a more spiritual way. Here you see Lester and Becky Cheatham, who chaired our Citizen Advocacy Board, Judge Frank Cheatham's wife, and Mrs. Reeves at one of our annual meetings. You'll notice Mr. Welcome came to the meeting, again, by ambulance from the nursing home, literally came to the meeting in what looks like a bed. Next. Here you see Mr. Welcome with his brother Willie at an annual meeting a year or two later. Mr. Willie is the only one of the Welcome brothers that stayed in Savannah. All the other children left the American South for better opportunity in less repressive parts of the country. Now, I don't want to romanticize the neighborhood. In the Cuyler-Brownsville neighborhood, Mr. Welcome was known as Cripple Waddie, and Willie was known as Crazy Willie. So, and they lived together in the Cuyler-Brownsville neighborhood until, again, neighbors decided Willie wasn't doing a good enough job. Willie passed away almost right after this photograph was taken. It was a great loss because he could understand some of what Mr. Welcome said. You'll notice that Mr. Welcome's beginning to look more like a jazz musician in this picture with his signature shades. Next. Here's Mr. Welcome with Mrs. Reeves, of course, Carmelo Alifi, an art teacher at St. Vincent's Academy, who started knowing Mr. Welcome, and then Jane Fishman, a columnist with Savannah Morning News, Gene Downs, arts editor for Savannah Morning News, and then so gradually Mr. Welcome is meeting more people and becoming more well-known in Savannah. Next. Here you see Mrs. Reeves using one of her tools of hospitality. And Mrs. Reeves had many, many clever tools of hospitality, but this is one of them. Mrs. Reeves always traveled with like 20 or 30 or 40 peppermints in her purse. And when she would walk in a room, she would have peppermints in her hand. And when she walked in, if she didn't know you, she flung a peppermint at you. Or if you were in a meeting and you weren't paying attention, she flung a peppermint at you. And you can see we've actually caught her here with her hand in motion, flinging a peppermint. Next. So during this time, Mr. Welcome's living in a local nursing home, and Lester is his citizen advocate. And during that time, Lester becomes Mr. Welcome's representative payee to guide his financial affairs. He acquired a medical power of attorney after an incident when an emergency room doctor tried to put a do not resuscitate order on Mr. Welcome. a staff person at Candler Hospital in the ER broke protocol. They defied the rules to do the right thing. And they called Lester, who said, no, 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 that's not what's going to happen. And he went immediately to the hospital and stopped that. That weekend, he and Jeff Alden, someone you'll meet a little bit later, went to the hospital and spent a couple of hours on a Saturday laying out options for Mr. Welcome and asking yes, no questions and allowing Mr. Welcome to describe what he wanted. And Mr. Welcome was old-fashioned. He thought when you came to the hospital, the idea was to get better and leave the hospital. So he wanted whatever they had to keep him alive and keep him going. So an increasing number. So Mr. Welcome is living in Westview Nursing Home, and an increasing number of people are getting to know him and one another. And about this time, Mr. Welcome hooks up with a small group of people who call themselves the storytellers. I now ask you, next slide, I now ask you to close your eyes and just do your deepest listening, please.
In 1993, I became one of the founding members of a grassroots organization called the Storytellers. It was modeled after the Highlander Folk School. Highlander is legendary as the place where the strategy of the civil rights movement was forged. We Shall Overcome was first sung there. Miles Horton, one of its original founders in the 1930s, understood the importance of creating a space for people to learn and gain personal strength by hearing about each other's experiences. The mission of storytellers, through listening to each other's stories, learning each other's dreams, was to form a support system that would assist some members living in nursing homes to move back into community life. Jillian Grable was known around the state for her work in person-centered planning. We asked her to come to Savannah for a series of work sessions. Several members of Storytellers were anxious to develop circles of support as a first step in planning for lives outside of nursing homes. I agreed to be in Waddie Welcome's group. What we knew about Mr. Welcome came from Mrs. Reeves and Lester Johnson. We thought he couldn't speak, but he made it clear he was miserable living at Westview Nursing Home. He wanted out. As we met in the corner of the Bow Street Baptist Church Social Hall that Saturday morning, Waddie Welcome, Deborah Selman, Tom Lamar, Jeff Alden, Dottie Black, and I tried to learn more about what Mr. Welcome wanted. He challenged us to develop a method to understand his language, a mixture of facial expressions and gestures. He showed us he could reliably answer yes or no questions. By giving him options to choose from, he was able to paint a clear picture of what he wanted his life to be like. We took turns writing on large sheets of newsprint tacked to the walls with masking tape. We drew as much as we wrote, stick figures for people, simple buildings. Mr. Welcome was delighted to see his ideas come to life in those drawings. Later, we used the wallpaper to help us remember what we had discovered. We tried to see the real Waddie Welcome and value him. We worked to define and understand the roles he could play if given the opportunity. Historian. He had seen a lot of history in his 79 years. Teacher. If we could understand what he had to tell us. Dreamer. If he'd been able to hold on to his dreams, we'd like to learn how. Community builder. We had no idea how very prophetic that would be. When we got it right, Mr. Welcome would reward us with a laugh and a delighted smile so big it spurred us on to discover more. Like a puzzle unraveling, the more pieces you put together, the more you want to do. Sometimes when we got it wrong, he laughed and rarely got frustrated. The group process worked. When one of us bogged down, someone else had an idea. We left that day with several prizes. We'd cracked the communication challenge. We'd learned Mr. Welcome wanted to live in a house with a family with children, with the smell of good food cooking, that he was a determined man. And the biggest prize, if we as a group could figure out how to make it work for Waddie Welcome, a 79-year-old man with cerebral palsy who had outlived his parents and siblings, then there wasn't anyone in the state of Georgia too old or too disabled to live in the community. We left with assignments. Learn more about Mr. Welcome's preferences, passions, and family. Kyler Brownsville, his former neighborhood and neighbors. Learn about his church, about Medicaid waiver programs. What could they offer him in the way of service? Deborah Selman, who was active in the disability rights movement because of a near miss on nursing home placement herself, became the circle facilitator. She researched Mr. Welcome's family and copies of Savannah's Kohler City Directory dating back to 1910. She helped him to send Christmas cards to old and new acquaintances to strengthen and enlarge the circle. She badgered U.S. Representative Jack Kingston until he sent a staffer to visit Mr. Welcome in the nursing home. She reminded other circle members to complete their assignments. Circle members didn't want to admit to Deborah that they hadn't done their homework. Along the way, we added members to the circle. State Representative Regina Thomas, Sylvia Kemp, who would later provide a place for Mr. Welcome in her home, Herman and Linda Friedman, local business people, Deacon Washington Hart and Jane Fishman. Mr. Welcome's nieces, Mary Welcome Williams and Margaret Welcome Jackson, and their children joined the circle. Once, Lester Johnson, a Muslim, and my daughter and I, who were Jewish, visited Mr. Welcome at the nursing home on Christmas Day and laughed at the strength that our circle's multiculturalism gave us. Mr. Welcome beamed from his preferred place in the hallway near the nurses' station. An astute observer of human nature and a connoisseur of the female form, he commented on the flow of people and events, an arch of one eyebrow, a quick thrust of his tongue. He had a lexicon of language in his face. It took the circle almost 2 years to get Mr. Welcome out of the nursing home, including winning the fight for him to be eligible for the Medicaid waiver program. It took polite threats and subtle coercion, but it got done. It didn't hurt that Mr. Welcome's circle now included a state representative, the president of the Savannah Bar Association, a prominent local businessman, a former civil rights leader and historian, and a newspaper reporter among its many members. With funding for the in-home personal care he needed secured, Mr. Welcome moved in with Jeff and Kathy Alden until the family home with children he dreamed of could be found. I was there when Jeff wheeled Mr. Welcome out of the door of the nursing home and gently placed him in the front seat of his truck. My 10-year-old daughter and her friend helped make up Mr. Welcome's bed in Jeff and Kathy's house. I got to take the pictures, and I'll always treasure that afternoon. After all the talking, it was simple, it was quiet, but it was radical social change.
Next. And then in Susan's essay, she says, we started out meeting together and then we progressed to having parties. This comes from Susan Earl, who is a teenager, who's running the mimeograph machine next to Bayard Rustin and A.J. Musty at the Fellowship for Reconciliation in New York City as they planned the 1963 March on Washington. That's when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Ms. Earl here is not a novice, not a newcomer to social change. At the University of Wisconsin in the Vietnam War, she was active with the most radical student protest groups. We progressed to having parties. Mirrors the wisdom of two local citizen advocates. Neil Foster, a homemaker, a parent, and a visual artist, once said, you have to keep the social in social change. And W.W. Law, the most prominent and respected dean of the American Civil Rights Movement here in Savannah, who, when I was granted an interview 20 years earlier, and I asked, "What scares you the most?" which is not a bad question, he says, "People are so busy going to meetings, they don't have time to visit." Next slide. Next slide. And then in 1996, the University of Georgia asked to make a documentary film about Mr. Welcome, his allies and supporters. Mr. Welcome agreed, and Marcel Ritas shot and produced the film, Waddie Welcome, A Man Who Could Not Be Denied, and the film began winning festival awards around the country. Next. The video was premiered at the Carter Center in Atlanta to a crowd of about 300 people with a great turnout from legislators. Next. As usual, Mr. Welcome was attracting attractive people. Next. And then the video premiered in Savannah at the Ralph Mark Gilbert Civil Rights Museum. Next. The museum holds 75 people, and we expected that number. Next. But instead we had 150 people turn out. Next. So the crowd had to be split into 2 showings. Next. Here you see Mr. Welcome, sharp as always, quite frankly, looking like a future presidential candidate, I'm sorry to say, with a red tie and a blue suit. Who knew? Next. Mr. Welcome with Lester Johnson and Chatham County Commissioner David Saucy in the background. Next. The museum had been recently restored and it was, quote, accessible, but the elevator would be accessible to someone who used like a regular wheelchair, but not to the kind of wheelchair that Mr. Welcome had, the reclining wheelchair. So Kim Abbott picked Mr. Welcome up and carried him up 4 flights of stairs and then back down. And then for the second screening, up 4 flights of stairs and then back down. Next. Here you see Deborah Selman, an activist and a friend of Mr. Welcome's, Herman Friedman in the foreground, a prominent local businessman. And then behind Herman, you see Kelvin Barnes, who is providing some personal support to Mr. Welcome. And just to say, in my experience, there are people who provide personal support as a job, and there are people who provide personal support as a calling, and Kelvin would fall into that second category. He had a deep affection for Mr. Welcome. Next. Here you see Mr. Welcome with Pat Puckett, who was running the Independent Living Network at that time. Pat was among many people from Atlanta who came down for the showing. Next. Here you see Mary Welcome Williams, one of Mr. Welcome's nieces. Some people, both related and family friends, saw and heard the publicity for the event, and they came for reconnection, which began to again strengthen and build Mr. Welcome's friendships and the people in his life. Next. And then Mr. Welcome and his friends and allies won the Tash Collaboration Award, and Mr. Welcome wanted to go to Seattle to pick up his award, so people got organized and went out to Seattle. Next. Here's Jillian Grable, who had produced the movie, and Mr. Welcome looking sharp out in Seattle. I would like to quickly point out that you see Mr. Welcome has on a green coat, and then he has a London fog draped over his feet. That Susan made sure that went out and bought that coat so he did not have to wear a blanket over his feet. A blanket suggesting infirmity, a London fog suggesting business person. Next. And here you see Mr. Welcome kind of looking like sort of a weathered traveler, you know, like one of those Nanook from the north, make it happen kind of people. Next. And then Mr. Welcome's acceptance speech. Next. My name is Waddie Welcome, and I thank you for this honor. This is recorded on a voice box. I've been blessed to have family, neighbors, church, and friends. My oldest friend, my deepest friend is Miss Addie Reeves. She's 97 years old and told me that if God had meant for her to fly, she'd have wings. So she did not come to be with you here today. I hope you can learn some of life lessons from Jillian Grable's video. In the video, you will see Ms. Reeves and a woman named Deborah Selman. Don't try to cross them. That's a lesson a lot of people in Savannah have learned. Again, thank you for this honor, and 1,000 people standing ovation. Next. Later that year, Jillian married Judge Johnny Mason in Atlanta. Mr. Welcome traveled to Atlanta to attend the wedding and reception. Next. And Mr. Welcome, so by now, Mr. Welcome is beginning to meet and become known by prominent people around the state, particularly in the legal community and, quite frankly, in sort of the civil rights community as well. Next. Then Mr. Welcome wanted to have a birthday party for Ms. Reeves, and so Mr. Welcome and friends hosted a birthday party for Ms. Reeves' 96th birthday at the home of Jane Fishman. Next. Here you see State Representative Regina Thomas and Deacon Hart from Connors Temple and some women from Mr. Welcome's church at the party. Next. And of course it rained. Here you see Jeff Alden and Mr. Welcome braving the rain together. And then next. And yes, Miss Reeves did eventually blow out all 96 candles. And then next. And then an invitation, a big 4th of July, 85th birthday for Mr. Welcome. Next. 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 And then in December of 1999, the newspaper Connect Savannah ran an issue about the 10 most influential people in Savannah. John Barrett got in because he wrote the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil that kickstarted the tourism industry here. Next. U.S. Representative Jack Kingston was one of the 10 most influential of the decade. The quote reads, "His integrity generates broad political support." That would later turn out to be untrue. And next, Mr. Waddie Welcome was one of the 10 most influential as well. Waddie Welcome, surprising new leader. At first glance, Waddie Welcome looks anything but influential. He's mostly quiet and unassuming, but beneath the years, beneath the persona of disability, lies a fierce determination, a determination that's influenced thousands across the state, the nation, and increasingly the world. Mr. Welcome's message was ripe for Medicaid laws that had grown ineffective and obsolete. In hopes of lobbying legislators, copies of his film were forwarded to state representatives. Hunter Hurst, chairman of the governor's Blue Ribbon Task Force on Community Services, said, "Mr. Welcome's video was used repeatedly to help create a political environment much more friendly to community services and other options to nursing homes." Ironically, Mr. Welcome has used the very thing that's handicapped him since birth, his body. He uses it to raise awareness and mobilize action. By pushing his own agenda, he now pushes public policy, and by pushing public policy, he's making an impact for future generations. His message is a growing influence, not only in the city and state, but nationally and internationally. Next. Waddie Welcome, a man of few words, an agent of change, a surprising new leader. Next. I ask you to close, if you will, close your eyes and do your deepest, deepest listening.
In November 2000, after living in 4 different family homes, Mr. Welcome decided he wanted to move back in with Jeff. They had continued to be close over the years, and as a nurse and a longtime friend, Jeff was familiar with the care Mr. Welcome needed. Among the things they had in common were their faith, sense of humor, and a love of shoot-'em-up westerns. Jeff made his light-filled front room into a bedroom where Mr. Welcome could look out at the oak trees in the yard. He built a ramp and found a used van with a wheelchair lift. They were looking forward to having good times. Then Mr. Welcome developed some health problems, which resulted in a hospitalization. Circle members were surprised when his health suddenly deteriorated and he was placed in intensive care on a ventilator. All of December, he remained in the ICU. We took turns visiting every day, 6 visits a day for 29 days. It was intense. Jeff brought Mrs. Reeves. The nieces and their children came. Alberta Parker, who Mr. Welcome had lived with before moving back to Jeff's, came almost every day. Lester Johnson chose Mr. Welcome's cardiologist and asked him to oversee his hospital care because they both attended the same small mosque. Deborah brought a bulletin board from Mr. Welcome's ICU room to display photos of him with U.S. Representative Jack Hingston and other prominent civic leaders. A scrapbook of newspaper articles, pictures, and stories about Mr. Welcome was placed on the workspace outside his room where doctors and nurses had informal consultations. Nurses who gave good care were sent personal thank you notes, and letters were written to their supervisors. Word traveled quickly about staff that seemed less skilled or concerned. Lester, Deborah, Jeff, and I sat in a circle in the family waiting room and held hands. We prayed. We cried and hugged each other. We bargained. We did what all the other families were doing. We met with the doctors who told us Mr. Welcome had liver cancer, and there was little chance of him going home from the hospital. We agreed we'd be happy if he could have just one day at home, off the vent. We thought we knew Mr. Welcome well enough to guess that would be what he wanted. We hoped we'd get the chance to ask him, and amazingly, we did. Beating the odds as he had done his entire life, Waddie Welcome improved enough to breathe on his own. A week later, he was able to go home. We knew the cancer was fast-moving. The oncologist in meeting with 4 of us had said 2-3 months, maybe. Although we feared Mr. Welcome would spend his last few days in awful pain, that didn't happen. When Jeff called me at 2:30 in the morning saying, "Come over right away," I was a little surprised. Earlier that night when I'd visited, Mr. Welcome hadn't seemed so bad. But when I got there, his breathing was very rapid and shallow, and I agreed that, although I had never seen anyone dying, it did seem like that's what was happening. Mr. Welcome was going to teach us one last lesson. Jeff and I sat on either side of his recliner and touched him gently, reassuring him we were there. He didn't show any response. Jeff read the Bible aloud. Faye Jones, who had done Mr. Welcome's morning care every day, came in about an hour later. She clearly knew him well and loved him. Faye took my place, rubbing Mr. Welcome's forehead. I sat and rubbed his feet. His breathing was shallow, but he seemed peaceful. We told him we loved him, and we knew he had to go, and that it was okay. Faye said over and over, "Go on, soldier, take your rest." What a perfect word for Mr. Welcome. He was a soldier in so many ways. In the early morning, Jeff and Faye gently carried Mr. Welcome from his lazy boy recliner to his bed. And Jeff hadn't slept since the night before, so we sent him to lie down. I sat in Mr. Welcome's chair. Faye stood by him. In minutes, Faye said, "Susan, go get Jeff." We got back to Mr. Welcome and stood, all touching him. He breathed several times, then stopped. Jeff put his palm on Mr. Welcome's chest and said, "He's gone." I could not believe it. A second earlier, he was breathing and alive. Waddie Welcome was born on July 4th, 1914. He died January 14th, 2001, Martin Luther King holiday Sunday.
Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. His funeral was a fitting tribute to the man he was. Next slide. The church was full of family, friends, circle, and church members, and people from all over Savannah who Mr. Welcome had touched. Next slide. They were black, white, old, young. Some walked into the church, some wheeled in. There were out-of-town guests. Marcel Reedus, the filmmaker, was there. The choir sang, and his pastor, Reverend Biddy Mitchell, eulogized him. Ms. Reeves, now 99, sat right up front. Next slide. There was a letter from Governor Roy Barnes offering condolences to the family on the passing of this important man. Next slide. Next slide. Mr. Welcome was carried to Laurel Grove Cemetery where his parents are buried. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Mr. Welcome got one of what a lot of us in Savannah call it one of the big boy obituaries, and there are only 3 or 4 times a year that this would happen in that day. And so, again, one of the big boy obituaries that year. Next slide. Mrs. Reeves took Mr. Welcome's passing hard, but her faith helped her. Next slide. But a broken hip at the age of 99 was too much. Next slide. And at the age of 100 years and 30 days, she passed on over to a place that she knew would be better. Next slide. This is an editorial from the Savannah Morning News. As they say that the good die young, they never met Miss Addie Reeves of Savannah. Miss Reeves, who died Monday this week at the age of 100, was living proof of the power of one. The longtime resident was well known in her church, Connor's Temple, her neighborhood, mostly Yamacraw Village and Caton Homes, and in the wider community for her generosity, strength, compassion, and belief in human dignity. She touched and inspired hundreds, if not thousands, of people. She was best known for standing up for a former neighbor, Waddie Welcome, who was sent away to an out-of-town nursing home after his parents died. Mr. Welcome died a year ago at the age of 86. He was a black man who had cerebral palsy in a wheelchair, a man that would be easy to overlook. Mrs. Reeves had limited resources, but she possessed a backbone of titanium. And with the help of Chatham Savannah Citizen Advocacy, she brought Mr. Welcome back to Savannah. A native of Burke County, Miss Reeves was one of 10 children who grew up on a farm and learned the value of work and of cooking. If people went away hungry after sitting down at her table, it was their fault. A funeral service is scheduled for 12:30 today at Connor's Temple with burial at the family home place. While her death is sad, her life is cause for celebration. If this one woman changed her corner of the world, think what could happen if others followed her example. Here were her lessons of life. Live and try to treat everybody right, even the ones doing you wrong. Keep it in the hands of God and go on. I don't care anything about style. You want to look beautiful? Serve God. Well, Addie Reeves was a beautiful woman. Next slide. A year later, folks raised some money to have a marker erected at Mr. Welcome's grave. Here you see Mary Welcome Williams and her 2 boys. The marker reads, beloved son, brother, uncle, friend, and teacher. Lester Johnson told a story at the funeral. Lester Johnson told a story at the service. He was at St. Mary's Catholic School in the Kyle of Brownsville neighborhood in the 1950s as a child. Kids would go around the corner sometimes before school to a little store to buy candy and stuff like that. Sometimes, though, they would go to a house where you could buy things a little cheaper. But if you went to the house, you might see the monster. The monster being Waddie Welcome, watching over his mother's sale goods on the porch. And Lester said that when he would have old friends come back to town for a reunion, or maybe to come back to town to bury an aunt or an uncle or a mother or a father, he would tell them about Mr. Welcome. And he would say that Mr. Welcome in his own lifetime had gone from being the monster to a profound, unexpected teacher. Next slide. And next slide. And as always, back for food and fellowship, because you do have to keep the social in social change. Next slide. So Waddie welcomes all those things you see, all those things you've seen on your program. This is the eulogy. for Mr. Welcome. But Waddie Welcome was also a kidnapper. He had a way of catching your eye with his eyes, those fierce, intense eyes. And once he had you with his eyes, he would use that amazing smile and that quick laugh to hold you. Mr. Welcome kidnapped Ms. Reeves many, many, many years ago, and they had been a team for well over 50 years. Mr. Welcome kidnapped me in a nursing home. That's where I first met him. I took Lester Johnson to meet him, and he kidnapped Lester. And then he grabbed Deborah Selman and Jeff Alden and Susan Earl. He kidnapped Susan's daughter, Emily. He kidnapped my whole family. He kidnapped Lester's office staff. He grabbed Sandy Mole and Wayne Daughtry and showed them that you don't have to stay captured in a nursing home. Mr. Welcome had a way of capturing people and not letting go until you were a little better person. And Lord, if Mr. Welcome didn't manage to kidnap you and turn you into a better person, his teammate, Miss Reeves, would. And you know how she worked. First it's have a biscuit. And then it's, how about some stewed chicken and dumplings? And then it's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then you realize that the lady saying it was living it as well. Ms. Reeves kidnapped Jane Fishman and Linda Whittish and bunches of other people. Yes, Mr. Welcome was all those things that are listed on the program, but he was also a kidnapper too. Here's a little story about how he grabbed two people from Cleveland, Ohio, and let them go as better people. As we've talked about earlier, on June 19th, 1997, the video, Waddie Welcome, A Man Who Cannot Be Denied, was premiered at the Ralph Mark Gilbert Civil Rights Museum. It was a hot evening, and as the evening, we had a huge crowd, and as the evening wound down, a lovely young African-American couple came into the small lobby of the museum. They were from Cleveland, in town as tourists. Seeing the museum bustling with people, they assumed that it was open. When they stepped in, it took a moment to get their bearings in the room, taking in the mixture of black, white, old, young, standing, wheeling, and reclining people. I heard the young woman ask the museum staff person, "What's going on here?" And the staff person replied, "We're here to honor Mr. Welcome," as she nodded in his direction. The young woman's face first went to puzzled, and then to reflective, and then a soft smile with moist eyes. She had, I believe, just glimpsed the world better than the one she'd stepped out of or would be stepping back into, and she knew it. And that, my friends, was, is, and will always be the power of this man named Waddie Welcome. At first, he's a puzzlement to most people. And then to many people, he brings reflection and insight. And to some, a great and growing number of people around the world, really, he brings hope. Hope of a better world. A world where there's more listening, more laughter, and more love. Mr. Welcome brought all three of these things, more listening, more laughter, and more love, to life in his life. And the congregation would say, Amen. The beloved community is not a utopia, but a place where the barriers between people gradually come down and where citizens make a constant effort to address even the most difficult problems of ordinary people. It is above all else an idealistic community. And that is the story of Waddie Welcome and the beloved community. So we'd like to pose a question, if we may. What can we do to create a more beloved community in this, the time of the bully? Yep.
And I want to just share this Padlet board that we've invented, where we are inviting people to find the handout, which I'm going to send to everyone who's on this call, this one here that you've created, on how to do a kitchen table read.
Mm-hmm.
So you've created this, and we've put a note on there. Anything you want to say about this, or just that it's there?
Well, just that it's there, and if people do want to do a kitchen table read, it's very, very low tech, and you'll find that you need one copy of the Waddie Welcome and the Beloved Community book. It's all you would really need. And again, we give you just some really simple pointers on how to organize. And then if you do one, and we hope you will, if you'd like to reach back out to either of us, both of us by email, because we're old, and email us with anything that you'd like to share, photographs or comments or whatever. We're always interested in, again, this notion of the story. As John McKnight once told me, a story is only a story as long as it continues to be told.
Mm.
And so the more people that are willing to tell the story, then the story continues to be the story.
Okay.
I do want to encourage people, again, to touch in on Tim Snyder's work about tyranny, his 20 specific ways to resist. It's very common sense, and again, it almost anyone will see one or two or three that they feel like I can touch in on this.
Right.
And then the other thing I would like to again point out to people is these characteristics of people. There they are. Yeah, you've got them right there. These 20 points. And then the other thing I would like to offer to people is these characteristics of people who 300 interviews of people who risk their lives to save other people, the common characteristics of this group of people. And again, I think if you read this and kind of think about this, you'll learn some things. Well, I can't say what you'll do, but there's some things here that help us think about what it takes to do the right thing in times of great struggle and of great risk. And I'm not sure where else you would see that.
It's been really interesting to me to see today that Heather Pletz writing, the woman who has a Substack post on holding space, was writing about the time of the bully. And Priya Parker, who wrote The Art of Gathering, is writing today in her newsletter about the importance of coming together and finding our way forward in action. We have just a few minutes remaining. There was a question from Ron about the use of the word kidnapping.
Yeah, actually, Susan suggested I use a different word, and I forgot to use a different word. But I mean, but
It certainly is. It's an attention-getting word. It makes you, I mean, it's so, it's just not a word that you would normally associate. And it does get people's attention.
But it can trigger. I mean, we certainly appreciate that for some people, the word kidnap, if they've had an experience in their family, I mean, it's not a neutral word, certainly. I like the word soul grab that just came up. I think that was the phrase, soul grab. There might be another way to think. Might be another way to think about it. But just to say it, you know, Mr. Welcome and Ms. Reeves, between them, it was hard to come into their presence and then escape. It just was. I mean, you know, yeah. Yeah. And as you can see, we've still not escaped.
No, a lot to be learned from this story. You know, we really thought about Jack sharing this last poem
Okay.
from Margaret Wheatley to close this.
Yes, we do need a closing, and this is a wonderful poem by Margaret Wheatley. It's called Turning to One Another. There's no greater power than a community discovering what it cares about. Ask what is possible, not what's wrong. Keep asking.
Notice what you care about. Assume that many others share your dreams.
Be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. Talk to people you know. Talk to people you don't know. Talk to people you never talk to.
Be intrigued by the differences you hear. Expect to be surprised. Treasure curiosity more than certainty.
Invite in everybody who cares to work on what's possible. Acknowledge that everyone is an expert on something. Know that creative solutions come from new connections.
Remember, you don't fear people whose story you know. Real listening always brings people closer together.
Trust that meaningful conversations can change the world. Rely on human goodness. Stay together. And so we bring an end to this wonderful and memorable retelling of the Waddie Welcome story, who continues to capture our souls and our spirits as we need them to be reinvigorated in these most interesting and challenging times.
What a gift. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
We invite you to unmute and kiss each other goodbye in his fabulous.
All right.
Don't forget
Thank
to be
you
awesome,
all.
everybody.
Thank
All
you.
right, all good.
And we'll close this off.
We're going for a cocktail.
There you are. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. Bye.